Let's look at the Chinese super katana for smashing the Japanese. That's right, that's somewhat confusing intro there. I'm Matt Easton of Schola Gladiatoria. So what we're going to be looking at here is a type of katana-based, inspired, and I'll talk more about that in a second, Chinese sword used in the Ming dynasty. This particular recreation is by LK Chen. You can find a link right below in the description down here to this particular sword on the LK Chen website. Now this was actually sent to me months ago, but I have a big backlog of reviews to do. But as you probably know if you watch my channel regularly, rather than just doing straight up reviews, I like to do a bit of context. I'm famous for the context. Some people call me Captain Context. And on this channel, that means history most of the time. Now, actually, I don't have an enormous amount of history to impart on this sword, but it is nevertheless very, very interesting. This is a crossbowman's dao. Now, first of all, a dao is just simply the Chinese word for a single-edged sword, can even mean a knife as well. But this is from the Ming dynasty, and it's specifically for crossbowmen. Now, not to say that crossbowmen were the only sorts of people who would carry these sorts of swords. In fact, we'd also probably find them on certain types of other guard, and in fact there is a larger guards version which I'll be looking at in a future video. But also people like using composite recurve bows and so on and so forth. But in the Ming dynasty amongst many other things, including its naval forces and all sorts of other things, was famous for its crossbowmen. And if you think about a crossbowman is primarily there to shoot crossbow bolts at the enemy. In this period, that sometimes included the Japanese and various other people as well. China, as you well know, the Ming dynasty covered a huge area and had a lot of enemies on all sorts of borders. Now, the Japanese were particularly a problem for the Ming dynasty at sea. Okay, so particularly through piracy, but you know, on land occasionally as well. Now, this sword is it kind of marries Japanese and Chinese traditions. Okay, now let's look at that. Now, for reference and comparison, I have here a randomly chosen Japanese style replica katana probably based on a let's say early Edo design, so sort of contemporary. This is perhaps slightly later, but katanas like this, worn edge up through the sash, were absolute typical sidearms of the samurai. Okay, and wakasashi's shorter versions were often carried by spearmen and archers and other people as well. But in this period, this type of sword was absolutely typical and famously used by the Japanese. And moreover, this is actually a slightly longer one. So some people might call this an o-katana, which just means a big katana. However, probably at this length, this is about a 31-inch blade. This would probably just be considered a katana, but slightly at the longer end of the spectrum. At various periods in Japan, you do get swords with either tachi or katana with longer or shorter blades. And actually in this period, 31 inches is not that unusual for the Muromachi and early Edo period. So if we go into what's the equivalent of the medieval period in Europe and the Renaissance, actually often blades were longer than they often were later on. So a lot of people's familiarity with katanas is with sort of a 27, 28 inch blade, even less sometimes 26-inch blade. But actually if we look at a lot of originals from the Muromachi and even the earlier Kanban and Edo periods, we often find they have blades actually over 30 inches. So, and that wasn't particularly unusual. So this is slightly longer to suit me. And this type of sword was being used by Japanese pirates and raiders and ne'er-do-wells, ronin essentially, who sometimes interfered with Chinese trade and got into fights with the Chinese. Now, on one hand, the Chinese were very impressed by Japanese blades. There's no question Japanese blades were very, very good quality. Japan was covered with swordsmiths making very nice quality blades, and they did export them. Now, there were different laws in different parts of Japan at different times, but at certain points they were forbidden from exporting them, but that tells you that they were exporting them anyway, because when you have prohibition on something, you know it's happening illegally. But in addition, we also have records from China which state that huge numbers of Japanese blades were being imported to China and being kept in armories. So, Japanese swords became, in the Ming Dynasty, very influential on Chinese sword designs. So now back to the original sword, back to the crossbowman's dao. Therefore, what we have here is essentially a Chinese sword. Most of them would have been, maybe some of them would have had Japanese imported blades, but a lot of them would have been completely made in China, but the blades were partially, or and sometimes entirely, inspired by Japanese blades. So here we have it, but it's big. So even by Japanese standards of the day, this is not quite a nodachi. It's somewhere between, so this is a 34-inch blade, thereabouts. It's somewhere between really the top end of katanas of the time and the kind of lower end of things like nodachi. It's not as big as a nodachi is, but it's bigger than most katanas are. And this is an interesting point, and this is based incidentally on a original example in a collection, private collection I believe, in China. All aspects of it, the guard, the hilt design, and the blade style. Now you can see that this blade style is heavily influenced by Japanese swords of the time. However, as I say, most of these would have been made in China, so made with Chinese steel, Chinese blade making technology to Japanese designs, and occasionally there may have been imported Japanese blades mounted on these. But the hilt is really Chinese. First of all, if we look at the guard, superficially we could say that the tsuba on a Japanese sword, katana, wakizashi, whatever, is disc-like and fundamentally similar, I suppose, to Chinese. But then again, disc guards were quite popular over quite a wide area of Asia. And this particular design is very much Ming Dynasty Chinese. And it was standard at this time. Well, yeah, on most Ming Dynasty swords, you have some form of disc guard. So really we've got a Chinese guard, but even more than that, the style of the grip is absolutely Chinese. Okay, we have iron mountings, iron ferrule at the top, which you could compare these with a fuchikashira on a Japanese sword, but the style of them and the way they're manufactured is very Chinese, very simple in this case, just iron bands essentially, and this is a cap. But more importantly, perhaps, if we look at the end there, you will see it is peened. So just like a European sword, a lot of Chinese swords at this time, in fact most Chinese swords in the Ming Dynasty as far as I'm aware, were peened at the end exactly like European swords were throughout the medieval period and Renaissance, and in fact all the way up to the modern day. So we have a through tang going all the way through here and riveted at the end. That's completely different to how Japanese swords are secured, because with the Japanese sword, the tang, or nakago, goes up inside here, and it doesn't reach all the way to the end of the suka. It goes up to some way up, sometimes they only go about halfway up actually, and we have makugi, peg, pin, holding it right the way through. So we have a hole in the tang and it's held laterally, it doesn't go all the way through to the end. And that's how Japanese swords are traditionally made, and in fact that's how lots of Chinese swords were traditionally made as well, but not in this period and not this type of sword. So the other thing to mention as well is the wrap, which in Japan we call an ito, but obviously it's not in China. I don't know what the Chinese word is, but the wrap here is absolutely characteristic of Ming Dynasty swords. And in fact this follows all the way through to the Qing Dynasty, all the way through to the 19th century, and in fact Boxer Rebellion 1900. I've had antique swords through my business, Easton Antique Arms, from China from that period, and they have this exact same type of grip wrap on it. So it's maybe got some ancestral connection to the Ito wrap on the Japanese sword, but it's really differently done. And as you can see, a very intricate pattern of tying it essentially, which is completely distinct to these Chinese swords, and continued, as I say, all the way through to the 20th century. So essentially what we've got here is a sword that is Chinese. It's very much part of Ming Dynasty China, and But it's clearly also, the blade specifically is heavily influenced, the shape of the kisaki we would call it if it was a Japanese sword, heavily influenced by Japanese swords, the narrowness. Traditionally, Chinese swords had tended to be, at least single-edged swords, had tended to be broader and not have that style tip on them. So the blade is very much inspired by Japanese swords, and also there is an implication in the written sources that these were designed to smash the Japanese. So the Chinese had encountered the effectiveness of Japanese swords. You know, I'm not one of these people who poo-poos or talks down how good Japanese swords are. Japanese swords are fantastic for their intended purpose and do a really, really good job. Very effective cutters. And clearly the Chinese were so impressed with them that not only did they import thousands and thousands of blades from China, but they additionally copied them, essentially copied parts of the design. So what we have here with the crossbowman's dowel is really a marriage of Japanese inspiration brought into Chinese manufacture and design, and ended up with a sword that is longer reaching with, for the most part, a longer hilt than a typical katana anyway, and a longer blade than a typical katana, so that you can outreach your opponent who's using a typical katana. Obviously, if they're using a nodachi, then that becomes a moot point, but nevertheless. Now, in terms of why crossbowmen were armed with these, you have to recognise that Ming Dynasty Chinese crossbowmen were an extremely important part of the army, but when you're carrying a crossbow and bolts, and you're armoured as well, you can't carry an awful lot of stuff. You can't really carry a shield very easily. I think there's some implication they did use shields sometimes. But if you can only therefore carry one backup weapon, you can't carry a pole arm as well, you can't carry other big things, but you can carry something that you can wear. And these were actually suspended from the sash, essentially, below the belt, pretty much how a longsword would be worn in Europe. And so this is a very, very formidable backup weapon. Now note, they are not massive because Chinese crossbowmen had to be able to carry all of their other stuff, their crossbow, which is quite heavy, and the bolts that go with it, and this kind of stuff. So they wanted a big sword. They can't carry a shield and a spear or something like that, so you want a weapon there in hand-to-hand combat where they can be formidable enough to defend themselves and fight against people who are perhaps better equipped for hand-to-hand combat. But equally, this is one object alone that you can carry which makes you a more formidable fighter. Now, funnily enough, there is a parallel here with medieval Europe. If we look at Burgundian archers who were formed in emulation of English archers in the 100 Years' War and up to the year 1500, there are not royal but ducal essentially edicts saying that the archers were to be armed with long swords, which is basically the same as this. This is about the same size as a European longsword. It's got maybe a slightly longer hilt than most European longswords do, but the blade is about the same length, it's about the same weight, it's about the same size, and probably carried for very much similar reasons to why European archers sometimes carried these. So I think these are absolutely fantastic weapons, and if you like Japanese swords, if you like katana, if you like Chinese swords, it's got something for both of those interest groups, and if you're interested in both, I think you're going to love this sword. I personally love how this handles. I have reviewed the Miao Dao from LK Chen. I've also got the bigger guard sword, which I'll review in the future. But this is probably my favourite of all of them because it's not massive. It's longsword size, basically. So you could wear it fairly easily, carry it around fairly easily, you can draw it fairly easily. And it just moves around really nicely. It's got very good distal taper, starts about 9mm thick at the base of the blade and tapers down to about 4mm, I think, maybe a bit more than that, 4.55. But it's got good distal taper, so it handles nicely. Forgive me for touching the blade, I'll oil it afterwards, but it balances relatively close to the hilt. Okay, so it's about 5 inches out, so it balances fairly close down here, and what's interesting is you do feel the weight, the mass of that cap on there that you don't feel with a Japanese sword. So it's not quite as blade present as a typical Japanese sword is. It has a little bit more of a European feel to it in terms of its balance, which is partly to do with the hilt length and perhaps partly to do with that end cap. And I've got to say, I do like a peened construction. The downside is you can't take it apart like a Japanese sword or some Chinese swords. but it is totally solid. If anything comes loose, you just peen that a bit harder and everything tightens up. I also really like the design of the guard, which is very well executed and absolutely is modelled on a surviving original. So this entire sword has been very heavily researched by LK Chen himself and is based on historical originals. The grip wrap is beautifully done. I should point out this is vegan leather, as they call it, so it's not real leather, which you may think is either a good thing or a bad thing. I don't know. Personally, I think I probably would have preferred if it was leather, but nevertheless, it's very well executed. So it feels great. The grip shape is nice and oval, so you can index the edge very well. It tracks through the air beautifully, and also it cuts beautifully. Now, I don't have the opportunity to really display how this is cutting at the moment for various reasons, but you can see on screen now some brilliant examples of cutting by my mate over at Aikidoka channel, and go and check that out. I'll stick a link below there as well. And you can see this thing cuts like an absolute beast. It basically cuts similarly to how a katana would do, with more reach. A fascinating sword, beautifully recreated by LK Chen, wickedly sharp. The steel on it, there's a couple of different steel options you can see on their website, linked below, but this one is pattern welded and is really pretty. I don't know if you'll be able to see on screen. Let's give it a go. There we go. Look at that pattern. It's really pretty. It's very dissimilar to Japanese swords, and I don't know how accurate it is to actual Chinese surviving examples, but it certainly gives a beautiful look to the blade and is nicer to look at than just a flat basic piece of mono steel. So hand forged, beautiful pattern welded steel, beautifully executed, absolutely rock solid, and handles like a dream. So check it out, and I hope learning about the crossbowman's Dao and the influence of Japanese pirates on Chinese military, Ming military, and the Ming's desire to crush the Japanese has been somewhat interesting. I'll probably look into that topic in greater depth in a future video. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you again soon on the channel. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.